So in this talk, we're going to be discussing a guy named John Stevens. And we're looking at him to talk about 4 terms in these 10 new terms in the second half of the class. And we're going to be looking at him to talk about collaboration, to talk about teamwork, to talk about leadership, and to talk about power. All of these things that have to do with how you interact with other people in creative problem solving. So I mentioned in an earlier talk, really the beginning of this second half, that sometimes problems are so big that you can't do it by yourself. In fact, most of the time, problems are so big you can't do it all by yourself. And it's super important to learn how to be a creative problem solver working with others. I was dean of the School of Architecture for 9 years, and I had a faculty member in that period who never quite learned that lesson. He was a brilliant, oh my God, brilliant guy. He actually had a PhD in physics. He wasn't an architect, but he was very interested in the thermal performance of buildings. And he was one of the very first people to do a model, a digital model, that would help you understand how a building would perform thermally after it was designed. So in the process of design, you could assess its energy consumption. And you can make a design move and see what implication that would have, and then change it a different way and see what implication that would have. A fantastic design tool. And he did the very first software in this area, a really primitive baby kind of software done for the Department of Energy under a grant for them. Brilliant guy, and that was a great accomplishment. Then the next step, of course, was to do a much more comprehensive and sophisticated version of that. But then it got way more complex. And so he was ready to move right into that and do it. And I can remember the discussion at the time of, I don't think this is something one person can do. This is super complex. This is going to take a team of people to do it. But this guy was just not a team guy. He wanted control. He wanted to do everything exactly right and exactly his way. And he wanted all the resources. He wanted to be able to do this. He even wanted big grants. But he couldn't get a big grant. He didn't have a team of people to do it. They weren't going to give a lot of money to just one guy on in his office in Sutton Hall. So he continued to work on this problem. But honestly, other people did form teams, and they got much richer collaborations, and they just outpaced him. And the next generation of software that replaced what he had done was all done by teams of 20 people or so. So it's so important to be able to identify the fact that for most problems, I'm going to need to know how to work with other people. So the guy we're looking at today, John Stevens, he had a very big problem he was trying to solve. And we're going to start by describing that problem. But let me just run through again those 4 terms we're going to be looking at. One is collaboration, this idea of working together, very much working hand in hand. So it's kind of all of us working with the same mind together on the problem. Or teamwork, which is a coordinated effort. One person doing part of the problem, another person doing their role, another person doing their role, and working together to solve the problem. Then leadership is that 4th term, which is guiding or directing or being the overseer that shapes the larger direction that the effort is taking. And then the 4th one is power. Just might, strength, force, the ability to make something happen, even if other people perhaps are not completely on board to do that. So that's what we're looking at in John Stevens. This notion of how do you operate when you're not in control of everything? How can you make solutions that other people contribute substantially to? So the problem that John Stevens is working on is the Panama Canal. And Panama Canal, of course, was connecting the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. It was really based significantly on the success of the Suez Canal, which had been built from 1854 to 1869. And it connected the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea through the Red Sea. And this had been done by France. And at the time, the French were the big engineers in the world. They had the best engineering schools. There were really two things that set them apart. One was the Suez Canal, which everyone knew about. The other one, later in the 19th century, was the construction of the Tour Eiffel, the Eiffel Tower. It was named for Gustave Eiffel, or Gustave Eiffel in French, who was a great engineer in Paris. So those two things, what was the tallest structure in the world made out of steel, really demonstrated the potential of steel in the Eiffel Tower, and this amazing civil engineering feat of connecting the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea with the Suez Canal. Now, the guy who really was central in the Suez Canal was a guy named Ferdinand de Lesseps. And he was called the great engineer, although honestly he had no credentials as an engineer. He wasn't trained as an engineer, but he had been the head of this big effort in Suez. And he was very successful at that, and he was a kind of national hero. So after they did the Suez Canal, it seemed fairly natural to assign Ferdinand de Lesseps to do the Panama Canal. Who else could do it better in the world than the French? So he just transfers his energy over to the Panama Canal. But this was a very different situation. And the French were there for 20 years, and they worked their asses off. But in the end, they failed to do the Panama Canal. And they failed for 6 reasons. The first is there were perpetual problems with private financing. So the Suez Canal had been private financing, and the way that worked was they sold bonds. Ferdinand de Lesseps says it's going to cost X amount of money, let's say $500 million. And so all these French individuals buy bonds in that, and then when the Suez Canal is up and running, they get the revenue that all the boats pay for going through the canal, and that then reimburses and gives a profit to the bondholders. And they thought, we'll do the same thing in the case of the Panama Canal. So they started out that way. The only problem was the initial estimate for what it would cost was way, way, way low. So they kept having to adjust the scope of the project financially. And those people who bought in at the beginning, they kept being told, okay, well, you used to have X% as your share. Now it's half X%, because we've had to get more bonds and we've had to sell more. And so your part of the profits is going to be smaller. And that happened a couple of times, and people began to say, wait, dude, not fair. And the private financing began to dry up because they had made these errors in estimating what it would cost. The second thing was there were perpetual political problems with Colombia. Ferdinand de Lesseps saw himself as a great negotiator. He'd go to Colombia, he was trying to get the rights to dig this canal through, but complicated politics in Colombia. At this point, Colombia owned that land where Panama is now, and he just could not get the permissions he needed to get. A third problem is continuous controversy over the route that the canal would take. We now look at the canal and they go, well, of course that's where the Panama Canal would be. But there were many other good possibilities. This route they took went right through a mountain range. That didn't seem exactly right. There was one up in what is now Nicaragua that went on pretty flat land and connected a lake that was in the middle, but it was much longer. There was just a question about how to go and what route was right, and they just could not make up their mind. A fourth problem was that it was very difficult to get a workforce in Panama. The locals were not trained to do construction and honestly didn't have any interest in doing it. They were subsistence farmers. All they wanted to be was subsistence farmers. They didn't want to be a part of this effort. So they had to import workers. But it's a tropical climate, so you can't just take people from France and move them there and have them work in that heat and that humidity. So they began to get a workforce from the Caribbean. But it was really difficult labor, and a lot of those people just would come for a while and then get on the next boat and go home. They had a hard time keeping their workforce there. There were also perpetual problems with the climate, rains like crazy. Construction is difficult with that kind of rains and flooding and mud. The sixth problem was perpetual problem with disease. This was the tropics. There were tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever and typhoid. All these French people had no immunities to those things, and they came to the tropics and they got sick and they died. And so it was all of these things, all six of these things, contributing to enormous problems that the French had. And finally, the French have to abandon the whole project. So 3 out of 5 of the French engineers that were sent to Panama died. A whole generation of these exquisite engineers with the best training in the world, they died trying to do the Panama Canal. There were over 20,000 lives lost in total in building the Panama Canal. And that was largely due to disease. Just thousands of people would die because malaria would spread like crazy among the workforce there. The French spent $287 million, 3 times as much money as they had spent on the successful Suez Canal, and still they had nothing to show for it. This, of course, because it was privately financed by French families. It was a disaster to the economy of France. All these people lost their savings, and there was huge rage over the whole failure in France. The national ego actually was greatly diminished. This idea of the French being the best engineers in the world, well, maybe not because of this huge failure. So about this time in the United States, up comes Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt was a major proponent of the United States building the Panama Canal. And he makes it a major part of his platform. And in 1902, he got Congress to purchase the authorization that the French company had to build the canal in Panama. And they purchased it for $40 million or less. And then the negotiations started with the French. Roosevelt was a big risk taker, and he was willing to stick his neck out on this. He thought the United States, he was a bully. He thought we can do this, we can make this happen. And he used spin to convince people that this was a sure thing, and we were going to do this. However, the initial efforts were not good. We went down there and spent a lot of money and didn't have any more to show for it than the French. The one thing that did happen in that early period was they identified this guy, William Gorgas, as a guy to help fight the health problems, the medical problems down there. And he went down there and began to really have some success. He was 49 years old. He was an expert on tropical diseases. He thought the mosquito was the real villain here. And they couldn't understand why they thought it was a communicable disease. And when somebody got it, they would isolate them. And they thought that would keep other people from catching it. But even people who were completely isolated still got the disease. And Gorgas said it's the mosquito who's biting an infected person and then transferring the disease to a non-infected person. Now, most people thought that was baloney, but there had been a little study done in Cuba that seemed to prove that out, and William Gorgas was hell-bent on making this happen in Panama to eradicate the mosquito and thereby to eliminate a lot of the health problems. Now, the real key to making this happen was getting John Stevens on board. He was a 52-year-old guy. He was an engineer and a construction man. He'd been very involved in construction projects internationally in the Philippines, in South America. He mainly built railroads. He was a railroad guy, but he knew how to go into difficult and complex topography and do a major construction effort. And so he was kind of identified by Roosevelt's team as the man to head this project. When he was brought on, the U.S. had already spent $128 million, and they had almost nothing to show for it. It was beginning to be as big a failure as the French, and Teddy Roosevelt wasn't about to let that happen. So the decision was made to go with Stevens, although there still wasn't a route, or a lot of those problems had not been solved. Stevens did something that was kind of what seemed to be crazy at the time. The first thing he did was he immediately stopped the digging. And people think, how do you build a canal? Well, you dig a hole, you dig, 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 dig. And that's what they'd spent $128 million just moving dirt. And the first thing he does is he says, stop all the digging. And then he began to build an infrastructure for actually solving the problem. The first thing he did was he built a railroad coast to coast, because getting people in and out to do the work, getting equipment in and out to do the work, getting the dirt in and out. They were digging the dirt out and piling it up on the side, and then later on realizing, oh my God, it all washed into the place we just dug, or oh my God, now we need to go through there and the dirt's in the way. So he said, nope, when you dig it, you get rid of it and you take it out of there. So the railroad was essential for moving everything in and out of this massive construction site. He knew how to build a railroad, so he did that. Then the second thing is he built communities. He said, I can't get a good workforce here, either for the laborers or for the engineers, unless there's a decent place to live. So he built little towns, and he built houses, and he built schools, and he built playgrounds and baseball fields and churches, and he made a place for people to live. These bright young engineers weren't going to move from the United States and leave their families back there. They wanted to be able to take their family with them. So he made communities in Panama where people could come and actually spend 5 years and work on this project and get it done. So you can see in the bottom left photograph there, these really kind of nice homes and communities that he built very quickly in Panama. And then the third thing he did was he really addressed these health problems with the help of William Gorgas. Really made it happen so that people would not feel fearful of going down there, that they were going to get these tropical diseases and die. So this problem is way too big for one person, and he brings on a big team. So his team consisted of Teddy Roosevelt, who was the president, obvious part of the team, William Howard Taft, who was the Secretary of State, later became president, but he needed somebody who could do these diplomatic negotiations. Ferdinand de Lesseps thought, oh, I can do that, and he goes down and tries to negotiate with Colombia. No. Taft said, that's some other team member's job. I'm going to bring on the Secretary of State, and he's going to negotiate with Colombia. In the end, what happened was Panama became a separate country, and then they negotiated with Panama. And all of that was orchestrated largely by William Howard Taft. Very important part of the team. Another team member was Theodore Shorts, who was the head of the Canal Commission. He was the one who dealt with Congress, and he had really good connections with Congress, and Congress had set up this commission. Theodore Shorts was the head of it. He handled a lot of the political work internally with Congress. There was Dr. William Gorgas, his medical guy, totally a part of the team. He brought in a guy named James Hill, who had been his boss on these railroad projects he constructed. This guy really knew construction. Stevens wasn't stupid enough to think, I know everything here. My boss, he was even more experienced than I was. He brought him onto the team. So at one end, he had older, more senior people, but he also brought in these young, bright bucks, these engineers that were just fresh out of school. A 25-year-old guy named Robert E. Wood. Later on, that guy became the head of Sears and Roebuck, which was the largest corporation in America. This was a smart guy who was going to be very successful. Stevens identified him and said, I want you on my team. Then there were some specialized people, somebody to handle, sort of be the chief of construction, somebody to be the financial disbursement officer. All of these people were brought in to do special tasks. And then very much a part of the team were the 2,000 American workers. A lot of them engineers, but a lot of them other people that were brought in to administer the whole project. And they were given decent lives and decent housing, and they were treated well and paid well. And he had huge respect for them, and he really cooperated with them. He listened to them. He was a good team member with them. And then in the end, there were also these 20,000 day laborers, workers who were just out there doing the digging. And unlike the French, Stevens had enormous respect for these guys from the Caribbean because they grew up in the tropics. They were less vulnerable to disease because they'd always lived in the heat and humidity. They could do work without being exhausted in the heat and humidity. And he respected that enormously in them. But he also really got to know them. And one of the things he realized was their diet was almost totally carbohydrates. They had very little protein in their diet. They ate plantains and bananas and potatoes, and there just wasn't any protein in their diet. And he said, you know, they can build stronger muscles, they can be more effective workers, they can have more stamina if they get protein. So he began to offer them pork and chicken to supplement their diet. They loved that. And it greatly enhanced their ability as workers. He also started training programs for them to help them do their job better. He loved to tell the story of, he went out on the job site one day and there were 4 Caribbean guys who were moving the dirt from point A to point B. And somebody had given them a wheelbarrow. And so they shoveled all the dirt into the wheelbarrow, and then each of them took one corner of the wheelbarrow and lifted it up and took it over and dumped it out. No one had taught them about what a wheel does. No one showed them that one person could handle that wheelbarrow with that amount of dirt and wheel it over and dump it out. One person could do what 4 people were doing. But because they didn't understand a wheelbarrow, this was an alien object to them, they needed to be trained, and they needed to be trained to use every bit of equipment on the site. So this was the team. Everybody had their distinct job to do, and they were allowed to do it on Stevens' team. So he's using these various techniques. He's using collaboration. And when he's working with Roosevelt and James Hills, his former boss, he's working as equals with them. And they're working together on a problem, and they're discussing it, and they're collaborating. And then he's working as a team member and letting all of these people do their job without interference and just trying to support them in doing their job. A great example of that was Gorgas, who, you know, even Stevens was not sure about this mosquito thing. Was that really going to solve these health problems? And Gorgas is out there trying to eradicate all standing water because mosquitoes breed in standing water. And it was a huge public health effort, and it was expensive. And it took a lot of people to, scour the earth around there and try to get rid of all the standing water so there'd be no place for the mosquitoes to breed. Is that really going to solve the problem? Are we going to not get malaria because of that? Now we, of course, think that's true, but it wasn't proven at the time. Even though Stevens was skeptical, this is my man. This is my team member. I'm going to support the hell out of William Gorgas. and I'm not going to question it. And that was really important to Gorgas. So he worked well as a team member. And then leadership was another thing he was exerting. He was really choosing the right people, coordinating them, and really being an amazing leader, and sympathizing with them and understanding their problems. And it's really touching how much he cared about these 20,000 Caribbean workers and how he was a leader for them, and they wanted to do the best work they could because he was giving them the pork and the chicken, and he was treating them right. And they worked hard for him because he was a good leader. And then the final thing was power. And sometimes he did exert power, and sometimes that was necessary. So at a certain point, Congress wanted to get rid of Gorgas. They thought the whole mosquito thing was bullshit. And they were tired of Gorgas. And he kept wanting more and more and more money, and this was just ridiculous. So they wanted to pull the plug and get rid of Gorgas. And Stevens stood up for him and said, no, he's our man. This is the route we're taking. It's got to be that way. He spoke truth to power, and that was him exerting his own power. And they said, well, if you don't fire Gorgas, we're going to fire you. And he said, go for it, dude. I'm not backing down. And he had the power because he was being effective. He was their man. That gave him a certain amount of power, and he used it. And he told Congress, bullshit, I am not firing Gorgas. Now, they didn't appropriate the money that he needed to support Gorgas. So then he just kind of grabbed the money from other sources, and he had the power to do that. And he used the power to do that, to kind of undermine Congress. So, yeah, he needed to exert power. This also came down in the discussion about the route. Congress wanted to build it on the flat land, which was a much, much longer route. He wanted to build it on the shortest route, but that would require putting locks in. Congress liked the idea of just sailing on straight water. The locks seemed complicated to them. But he was an engineer. He understood how locks worked, and they seemed perfectly normal to him. And again, he just put his foot down and said, we're doing this route, and we're doing it with locks. If you don't like it, fire me. Again, they could not fire him. He was the key here. So he exerted his power in that regard. So it's really all of these things, collaboration, teamwork, leadership, and power, that enabled John Stevens to get the job done. And he really did get the job done. That route was chosen. All of the equipment was brought in to do it. The infrastructure was put in place. The right people were put there. And then when all of that was going smoothly, Teddy Roosevelt took the first trip a US president had ever taken out of the United States during their term of office. And he took a boat down to Panama to inspect the Panama Canal. And this is Teddy Roosevelt in one of those earth-moving machines. He was super delighted. He saw this incredible success that was on its way there in Panama. And then, shockingly, shortly after that, John Stevens resigned in 1907. We don't know exactly why he resigned. It certainly wasn't with any animosity. He may have had some personal problems. His wife was not happy about this whole project. She'd gone down and tried living in Panama, didn't really like doing that. So there were some personal issues, and he was a family man. He had loyalty to his family. He was exhausted. This had been incredibly taxing for a long period of time. Also, he was just a rebel kind of guy. He was ready for a new challenge. He wanted to take on something else. He wasn't the kind of guy who just kept all the wheels moving. So he rebelled in a certain way and was ready for another project, which he did go ahead and take on. But he had a well-oiled machine in place, and it was taken over by actually the military. A guy named George Washington Goethel took over the project, and the Army Corps of Engineers completed the canal. But it was really very much the blueprint and the trajectory that John Stevens had established. Now, the point here, when a problem is big, how do you solve that problem? Well, you have to learn how to utilize some of these 10 terms that have to do with relinquishing complete control. You have to learn how to be a collaborator. You need to learn how to exercise teamwork. You need to know how to be a leader sometimes. And you know how to use power sometimes when it's necessary and it's appropriate. So again, think about these terms. And in particular, think about what of these terms you might be good at or you might feel comfortable with. And what of these terms might give you a little pause, or it might need some work for me to be able to get good at that. And we'll be talking about that in our check-in. See you.